Good afternoon, and welcome to our new virtual conversation program called the Harvest Leadership Sit-Down Series. And this is designed to help you harvest your potential. I'm Ed LaFlamme, and I'm the moderator of today's webinar. In our new leadership series, the Harvesters will bring you the virtual in-depth conversational sit-downs with business leaders from the landscape industry and other service industries as well. Today, Harvester Cindy Code sits down with Isaac Roberts, co-founder and COO of Scythe. Am I saying that right, Scythe? Okay. Robotics, to discuss robotics and the changing landscape workforce. Isaac is an entrepreneur, and like many in the landscape industry, has a diverse career in starting up companies from concept to revenue generation businesses in many different industries. During our conversation with Isaac, we're going to be enjoying and learning about how and why autonomous mowers will make an impact on commercial mowing. How much of the landscape business can be realistically automated? How can contractors drive more revenue and improve cost efficiencies with autonomous mowers? How soon can autonomous mowers take the pressure off contractors when it comes to labor? I'm looking forward to that one. Could robotics shift the image of the landscape industry and attract a younger, more tech-driven workforce? And how can robotics reduce the industry's carbon footprint? That's a big one. But before we begin today's webinar, we'd like to thank Verizon Connect, Boss LN, and Coastal Source for their partnership of our Harvest webinar series. We'd also like to share a new program from the Harvesters because what we've just done is created a new account manager training course. Sorry for the fumble there, but the account managers, as you know, they're getting more and more difficult to come by. And they're very difficult to find. So many companies now have to take property managers or teachers and convert them to be account managers. And they have no experience with landscape at all. That's why Harvesters Bill, Fred, and yours truly have developed a comprehensive account manager training course with all the bells and whistles that you could possibly ask for. Check it out at harvestlandscapeconsulting.com. And you'll probably be seeing this in your email anyway. You probably have already seen it maybe last week, and you'll be seeing more. But it is the only one on the market today, and it's some close to 18 hours of videos, not all at once now. They're broken down into 5-minute segments, and there's over 160 videos like that. And of course, it's just chock full of tools you can use and information to be more successful. So and also I'd like to say before we begin is, if you have any questions for Isaac, all you have to do is type them into the chat box. You can see that on your right-hand side of your screen. And Harvester Cindy is going to be monitoring that very carefully. So sit back and let's enjoy our time together, and we'll turn our meeting to Harvester Cindy.
Thank you, Ed. We appreciate it. And welcome, Isaac. Thanks for joining us here today. We're looking forward to, okay, we can hear you, good. We're looking forward to a dynamic conversation on robots in the landscape industry. But before we really get in depth into that arena, we'd like the audience to get to learn a little bit about you and your background. So maybe just briefly, you can tell us, what it was like growing up in South Florida and in a family golf course business.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Venice and Sarasota and Orlando, Florida. And the first thing that I ever did, I didn't have an allowance. So I kind of just picked up the 21-inch push, or the self-propelled Honda that my stepdad had. And in addition to doing our yard, I ran around the neighborhood trying to do others. And this by no means makes me a landscaper. I do not take that lightly, especially these days. And I kind of experienced the pain. Every summer I'd be out busting my butt, carrying a weed whacker and pushing a lawnmower around the neighborhood to go and mow that grass. And then when I got old enough, I guess around the age of 12, I started working with my dad's company. And what they were doing was like golf course construction and irrigation, right? So the family business started out as just like residential irrigation company, and then they migrated over to commercial, and then they migrated over to like more municipality contracts, and then they got into golf. And from golf irrigation, it expanded into everything golf, to where they were just taking over like the entire construction process of it. So they'd start doing shaping was the last thing they took on. But this kind of led me in, and my dad said, well, you're going to be with me this summer. My parents split up when I was 2. So it was always, Sarasota with my mom, Orlando with my dad. And he's like, well, the summertime with me is summertime in the field. And, here's a shovel, and these guys will teach you how to cuss in Spanish, and you're going to learn to work your butt off. So every summer I'd be out there digging ditches and, laying down heavy pipe, anything from like 4 inches, I think was the smallest that I ever touched, all the way up to, like culverts and things. So exposed to that, I think it was kind of fascinating to see how hardworking everybody in that industry is. Like these guys would just wear me out, and they'd make a game out of it, right? It was all just a matter of like, how fast can I get the job done? And, like get it done so they could get out of there and start the next day and stuff. But it was just a nonstop slog of, like massive amounts of labor. So deep appreciation from my end. And one of the things that probably resonated with me a lot, thinking about it in retrospect from the position I'm in now, is one of the big impressions that it made on me was like how much like natural beauty got torn up building golf courses. And then seeing that the end result was this like beautiful golf course, and it's this like kind of like dichotomy of human beauty versus nature beauty, right? And I think one of the things that's been coming up for me recently is this understanding and realization that as humans, we will and do occupy like every square inch of the planet, right? Like we're going to continue to structure these environments over time. And landscaping, I think, fills this really important area that I didn't realize as a kid, which is that there's this like buffer, right? Like there's a buffer between Denver and Yellowstone, right? Like the area between the two, or in Denver's case, maybe it's the Rocky Mountain National Park, right? Like these buffer zones are what landscaping is. And I think that it's creating like a new fondness for me in the space overall.
Awesome. So did you envision yourself continuing in the landscape industry, or what were your aspirations, following those tedious summers?
Yeah, definitely not. They actually were grooming me to take over the family business. And I was kind of like, I think when I got old enough, I realized that I was being groomed for indentured servitude, which sounded great to my dad and uncle, I think. But I was kind of like, I want to go and do something else. And so I went and joined the military. But I went in this progression from, I thought that I wanted to, and I guess I really did want to get into genetic engineering ever since I was a teenager. I thought that was just a fascinating science, and it was very much in its nascency. Even now it's in its nascency, but it's something that I've followed all of these years with increasing excitement. But I thought that I'd be going to Georgetown and doing exactly that, getting a PhD in biology or genetics, and then, like focusing on that for my entire life. But, curiosity killed the cat, right? So I ended up going into all these different things. I built a GPS as-built system for my family's company before I left it. And going into the military was its own reward, I think. I'm very glad that I did that. And then since then, I've just been building companies one after another.
The Navy, right?
Yeah. I went in to be a SEAL because I wanted to learn how to blow stuff up. And I was much better at swimming than I was running. Turns out SEALs run a lot too. So that was a moot one. But yeah, I just spent 4, and then I got out. I got hurt at BUD/S, and so I wasn't able to go into SEAL training like I wanted. But then I got out and started focusing on chemistry, chemical engineering, and that kind of led me into my first couple companies.
I heard someone reference one time that you were a serial entrepreneur. What was your, in a good way, just briefly, what was the first company that you got off the ground?
I guess the first company that actually generated revenue that wasn't just feeding myself was an import-export business that I started in DC with two guys that were from Africa. And turns out Africa needed clothes, and they needed them cheap. And so we were actually shipping used clothes from Canada actually down to West Africa, and it generated a couple million in revenue before we just stopped doing it. It's kind of interesting to see arbitrage opportunities like that internationally, right? Where you say, well, you know, maybe corn is cheap in the Midwest, but down in Mexico they use it all day long for tortillas and they can't grow it, right? Those kinds of things in import-export were fascinating to me, but it was not something that would scale without just massive amounts of work. And that was around 2005, I think 2005, 2006.
Okay. And so then when did robotics come into your life or into the picture, and circle back to the landscape industry?
Yeah, so that is an interesting story. I had just sold another company that I was not very fond of, didn't like the industry, didn't like the people I dealt with. And this was around 2013. And a friend of mine, one of the sharpest guys that I ever knew, was working on a postdoc over at George Washington. And I knew that they were doing self-driving cars. And I was like, self-driving cars is amazing. Like, I've been a commuter my whole career pretty much, drive around a lot. It'd be fascinating to be able to get into that. And I think that's something that, you know, has a ton of value and would be really fascinating. And so I reached out to him and said, hey man, you're working on self-driving cars. Let's build a self-driving car company. He said, self-driving cars are really hard. Let's make a mobile app instead. And I was like, okay, but then self-driving cars. And so we took this technology that he was using. They were basically building it for the Predator drones to create topographical maps off of monocular lens video feeds, right? So Predator drones fly at a very high altitude. They're looking down on an area like Afghanistan or something, and it's a mountain range. And in order to do like troop movements, they need to be able to say, okay, well, this is the way you traverse this ridge. This is how you get from point A to point B across the mountains. And so they were using the Predator drone footage to be able to create these topo maps. And they needed math to do that. And so there was something called dense tracking and mapping, which is a sliver off of something else called simultaneous location and mapping, or SLAM. And so we put that into a mobile app. We ended up selling that after a year and a half to a company called Occipital over in Boulder, Colorado. And one of our other co-founders, it was basically three guys from the same lab and then me. Two of the guys went and worked with Occipital. I went and started another company. Vince went and worked for another company doing self-driving cars called Zoox, funny enough. And then a couple of years later, fast forward, and one of those guys that joined Occipital says, hey, so I really hate mowing my lawn. I don't understand why there aren't robots to mow my lawn. We should build robots to mow my lawn. And I was like, I also hate mowing lawns. Let's do this. So the whole self-driving car thing kind of came full circle, and we didn't really realize what we were diving into. Like at the time, we didn't understand anything about the labor pains that the industry faces today. We didn't understand all of the dynamics that go along with commercial landscaping. We didn't understand that, you know, mowing is effectively 40% of maintenance work, right? Like all of these things were learned along the way. Fortunately enough, by the harvesters reached out to Fred and just had some really fascinating conversations. He had been dreaming of robot mowers for decades, and it was just a natural fit.
Yeah, Fred does talk about, you know, his vision for using robotics in the landscape industry. And that notion has been there for quite some time. I think we're going to get into the kind of the meat of our conversation now. That notion's been around, and at the GIE Plus Expo in Louisville, the last, 3, 4, 5 years, there's been, little robots that have been running around the show, and I used our residential property. But going back to the commercial maintenance company, how can an autonomous mower relieve some of the pressure that you mentioned that 40% of the landscape company is mowing. But, is it a reality that autonomous mowers can help commercial landscape contractor?
Yeah, absolutely. Even today, right? Like with the technology that I've seen, even in nascent states, someone could deploy something today and gather some value. The problem is, I don't think that value is there yet, right? So stepping back a little bit and going to the quintessential robo mowers that Husqvarna and Works and all of these other companies are making, those are like light years away from what we're working at Scythe to build and what I see other companies focusing on with the commercial side, right? Like there's this interesting gap with Europe where it seems like European labor maybe is even more expensive than the US labor. And there's been and of course it's an older like set of countries, right? So everything is far more, this is this square inch, that's that square inch, this is the purpose of these square inches. So it's far more like mature in its like property allocation. And I think that that's created a good opportunity for companies like Husqvarna to make these, effectively Roombas for lawns because of the structure that goes into all of that. You can just place and install one of these robo mowers and then it'll go around doing its thing with boundary wires. But there's very little technology in those from, like a self-driving car perspective, right? There's not a lot of sensing. The major sensing is just identifying a guide wire. So you have to bury these guide wires. You have to do a lot of installation work. That doesn't work for commercial landscaping in the US, right? Not for the majority of them. Maybe if some commercial firms, like for example, I visited some guys that are with Mariani in Chicago, and they have some good opportunities to say, oh, well, this is a residential property that's a half acre or quarter acre, and they're a high-end client, and we can absolutely sell these things, place them, and then we'll just take care of the mowing, and we come in and do the high-value work, right? Because the mowing is the table stakes item that these companies are looking at, and that's not where they generate all their revenue, but that they can get a small sliver of work on top of the placement of these, it's a reasonable business model. What I think is more interesting is a higher utility of these technologies that we see in self-driving cars, where you actually have an understanding of the world around the robots, and you're not just saying it's okay to bump into everything. And so in order to do that, you have to have really powerful motors. You have to have a much higher compute. You have to have much better sensing, much more money in the sensor suite and all of that. And that, of course, goes into the cost dynamics, and then that goes into the business model problems that are, like to be faced still. But when it comes to commercial landscapers, like I think that that's the area that these companies are going to see a lot of value. And when you look at what's out there today, you see companies like Wright working with Greensey, where you see another couple of companies that are doing similar things with retrofits. And it would not be hard to say, well, if you just place it on this one property, or maybe you can say there are 5 different properties that would be valuable out of 500. It's like, there is value there, right? Like you could have one crew that just uses some autonomous system, but that I feel like that's not the end objective, right? The end objective is to say all of mowing can be taken over with robots, so that you can then convert a crew of 5 team members into a crew of 3 team members, and then you just have the robots go out, deploy, do the mowing, and then they can take care of the higher value work. And that's, I think, still in its development stage.
So that's considered kind of a key benefit. The autonomous mower gets you on the property and allows you to, the other crew members can spend time doing all the other work. And so do those other crew members, do they become experts in autonomy at the same time that they're learning to do the other high value work?
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for failure to me. It's like, you don't have to be an expert in circuit design to use a cell phone, right? Neither should you be an expert in autonomy to, run a robot. What what I think is going to happen is that you take the regular crew comp of 5 people today, and let's say it's 5 guys in a truck with a trailer, and they go out to a property. Right now, it's usually 2 or 3 of those guys hop on mowers, and then the other 2 guys might take a blower and a whacker, and they'll just start policing the area for the mowers. And then there's a workflow that starts, right? I think that workflow can change and likely will change over the next 5 years, right? As these systems become more ubiquitous and these like these crew members start to identify, oh, okay, this is the robot that's going to help me, get more done. They can adjust the workflow and the crew composition to be more efficient overall with the man hours that the company already has, right? And so we expect that this might be an opportunity for companies to scale their workforce by, anywhere from 20 to 40%, depending on how much is maintenance and how much of those properties, it can be performed autonomously. The trick there is if you have, if I look at some systems that are in my viewpoint very nascent, they might only work for wide open fields that are flat, right? And they might do it with pretty substantial safety lacking. That might only allow for a company to expand by 5 or 10%. But if you can actually replace 80, let's say it's somewhere between 75 and 95% of the mowing that's done currently manually with autonomous systems. And it really comes down to the quality of the autonomy, right? And that's what's so fascinating about this problem is that, I can make a self-driving car with a broomstick within 5 minutes, right? And it'll be self-driving for about 30 seconds until it runs into a wall. The same thing can be done for a mower. The caveat there is if I want it to be safe and if I want it to be autonomous for a long period of time with high quality autonomy, it goes back to the same thing. Data in gives you more to play with, and then that feeds into the quality of the autonomy that you're getting coming out from the user perspective.
So those are some of the barriers to entry, the robot learning curbs and trees and other obstacles along the way. How will the mower, we do have a question about boundaries. So, it's built into the software, but how would a crew member help that machine learn the boundaries of a property?
I'm reading the question from Neil right now. The question, if I'm understanding, I'm about to implement 3 machines in January where we'll have to put in wire fencing first. I have some thoughts, ideas, but would love to hear yours. So that sounds like some auto mower type scenarios, right? In the irrigation business, I use ditch witches a lot, right? They were definitely my friend. I did not like using the shovel if I could get away with a ditch witch or a trencher. So I don't know if anybody's doing this, but if it was me, I'd be looking at ditch witches for installation on these guide wires because that is far more effective than using shovels. I don't know but the problem is, of course, this is a heavy piece of equipment that not a lot of companies have, especially if they're doing residential stuff, which is where most of these units would be valuable in my eyes. So it might not be a great fit and it might be kind of overkill for what's necessary. But I would assume that there'd be a specialty business opportunity there to be able to say, well, all I'm going to do is install these things. And I'm just going to have a ditch witch run around that's maybe a micro unit. But these guide wires have to have full connectivity. So you can't just yank them and then they break. You're going to have problems there. But that means that you can bypass that by using a heavier gauge wire, but that might break the spec of the auto mower that's being used, right? I don't know too much about these other than to say it seems like it's potentially a lot of work to install, and these things might last for a couple of years. So the installation fortunately seems like it will survive multiple units as long as the specs are still met. I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but if there's some elaboration, I'm more than happy to try and dig in a little better.
Okay, thanks. So labor, even in a year like this, I know we started back in March and people were concerned about businesses being shut down. And thankfully, the landscape industry was deemed an essential business in almost every state. But for years and years, labor is a challenge. Good years, bad years, trying to find people. How realistic or how soon can an autonomous mower really come into play and help take the pressure off of landscape businesses, the labor challenge?
Yeah, so it's kind of fascinating to see the whole. I mean, the whole world has changed with COVID, right? But some companies have said, well, our labor problem isn't so bad now that COVID has created a bunch of other problems for everybody else that's non-essential. I am increasingly skeptical that that will be a long-term delta. So I expect personally that the labor adjustment will continue to be a problem. When it comes to where we are today, I think companies need to look really closely at the properties that they maintain. And what's fascinating to me is that the companies that I've had a lot of conversations with, and I'm sure a lot of these guys are on this call right now, job costing seems to be this big variable, right? Where it's like, well, I know that there's a number of man hours going into the job, or at least that it should be, and then the crews all flow properly. I think that there's a lot of value to be captured in the next couple of years with regards to getting that data surfaced for business decisions to be made, right? So if you take it from the robotics perspective, you can see that just to run a robot, you're going to get more data, right? The underlying technologies behind the robotics will be enablers for data collection that has never been seen before by the industry, right? So it's going to be a quantum leap in the amount of data that companies are able to capture and use, and hopefully that data is not just being siloed by companies and hoarded or something, but rather being surfaced for the companies to actually use for those decisions to be made. And of course, the more ubiquitous those robotics are in a company's fleet, the more valuable the data becomes, because it's not just about that one or two properties, but rather the entire fleet. But I'm curious as to, when it comes to what can be done today, I think that it really opens up the question of taking a strong look at the SaaS services that the companies are using right now. So whether that's Aspire or Boss or any of the others, In Control maybe is another. I'm not the expert in this area, but I know there are a lot of software providers that companies use, and I'm really curious about the policies that these companies will set going forward, right? Some companies might say, no, all of the data that's in our software platform is our data, and you can't gain access to it if you leave us. Other companies, they might say, if the robot company provides an API, we can tap into it. An API is essentially like a data handshake between two software protocols, right? So for us, for example, we can capture all this data from the robots and then hand it up to software platform companies to say, yeah, this is data that's valuable, that is literally field operation data that you've never seen before, and it completely eliminates the variables of these job costing items. And it'll be important to see how this ecosystem develops over time, right? Are these companies going to say, no, this is a walled garden and I'm not playing with anyone else? Or are they going to say, for the sake of the client, we want to make sure that we work with everybody that we possibly can? And then on the, not just robot side, but from the incumbent's perspective, I think there's an opportunity for incumbents to start generating this data as well, because although these internal combustion engine systems are the primary focus today, I don't think that's going to be the case in 5 years. I think there's going to be a shift towards electrical systems. And I think that that's interesting for both the vendors of the equipment manufacturers and the equipment manufacturers themselves, right? Because ultimately, if I buy a weed whacker from Husqvarna or something, and I have the ability to detect or to know when that weed whacker is being used, and I have the GPS coordinates of where that whacker was used, then I can say, well, that was $18 of my labor being spent on this one job property, despite the fact that the truck never actually moved from job site 1 to job site 2 because they're in the same parking lot, kind of thing. The level of granularity is going to be fascinating, but I'm not seeing a ton of it out there right now. And from what I mean, for what it's worth, I know the big desire is like figuring out what can be done today. And I would answer that, in the relative framework of, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step, right? And the first step that everybody should be looking at right now, while robots are being developed and these things are starting to come to light, should be, what are the tools that are used today, and how are those tools going to play with the equipment in the future, because it's absolutely going to happen.
And data is a huge part of a landscape business, especially for those that are into the numbers side of the business. But more baseline, there are autonomous mowers that are capable of mowing commercial property as we speak, and as a starting point, they could work side by side with crew members, at the same time that the landscape owner, is really looking down the road and understanding all the data points. I know that, one of our questions from Florida, how soon will they see autonomous mowers in Florida?
Yeah, autonomous mowers in Florida. My very blunt answer is about 12 months ago, because that's when we were down there mowing in Florida with our robots. My more serious answer is technology is a very fascinating thing, right? It's like, there are self-driving cars today. I just don't have one, right? There are autonomous mowers today. Most companies just don't have one. The real answer to that question, or I should say the real question behind that question, is when will robots actually be scaled and brought to market? And I would say that that's probably my answer there would be the most likely scenario is that someone rushes to market with something that is not incredibly safe. And that will probably happen in the next 6 to 12 months. Because it's like I mentioned, self-driving cars, right? Like I can make them self-driving with a broomstick. Just give me a car and the broomstick and I'll get to work. But when it comes down to safety and being able to handle slopes and go around trees, not just stop in front of them, or making sure that you don't run over a person or a dog or a sprinkler head or a valve box or a irrigation controller. These are very different animals, right? And so, not to get into Scythe, because I can't talk too much about it for intellectual property purposes here, but we are taking it incredibly seriously at Scythe. So we have been dragging our feet with full-scale production for this reason. We want to make sure that the robots that we have in the field are performing well and performing safely. We don't want to have an accident from someone. We've seen people playing with robots in the field, whether that be an auto mower or a really big, much larger piece of equipment that's bigger than even what we're making, or even ours. We've seen danger spots where things could happen, and we're very grateful that nothing has happened to us during testing. And we would have been very surprised if something had happened, because of course we're hyper focused on safety. But I think that it'll be possible for companies to get their hands on something within the next 12 months. The question is, like, how safe is that, and what kind of guards need to be put up to monitor it? Because I would caveat this by saying, if I have a football field that I'm mowing, right, and I can make sure that there's no one on the football field, I could use a pretty basic autonomous system, right, and it'll go out there and do that. The question is, me looking at the mower costs the company just as much as me riding the mower, right? So if I'm paying for some kind of autonomous system that requires babysitting, there's not a lot of value there from my perspective for the companies. So the trick is to identify the user, like the use case or the user experience, and make sure that the autonomy matches that requirement, so that the company can actually scale those things profitably. Because there's another example I can point to that's a industry use case, or I should say an industry case study. I think a company called Precision was bought by MTD, and Cub Cadet rolled it out as a greens mower, right? And so it's based on over a decade old technology where they were using these base stations. And so they would install telemetry base stations around the greens for the golf course. And so you're looking at 18 holes, 18 greens. And each one has, I think, at least 3 or 4 pylons, right? So these base station points, and then you take these pylons off the mower and you place them on this, on these like stands, and then you take the robot and you push it into the middle of the green, and then it's using those base stations to identify telemetry, and you bury a guide wire around the green, and all of this is for the robot to be able to localize and understand its bounds so that it can then do greens mowing. And greens mowing is, let's be honest, like greens mowing is more work than mowing any other area per square foot than like is else on the planet probably. So maybe it made some sense, but when I went out and saw companies using it, like we talked to Brian at Presidio very early, and of course my background with golf, I thought this would be the big focus for us as a company. I just saw people staring at the robot while it was working, right? So they would set it up, it would do its thing, it would be a robot mowing the green, but then they would be raking the bunker for an hour, and then they would have to, the mower would stop its mowing, and then they would have to manually load it back up on the trailer and drive to the next green in their, in their club car. And it's like, I understand why Cub Cadet killed that product, right? It's because they realized the same thing that their customers did, which is this doesn't make any sense. So it's important to not get swept away by the nuance and actually be focused on the actual use case, as opposed to just, yeah, it's autonomous, it'll do all the things, because I see how that happened for the golf companies, and now those companies are no longer supporting those products because they're failed products, and that is a problem that we are making sure we address at Scythe, and I think the companies that we are talking to and everybody on this call, I think, should be focused on that as well.
Well, the importance of safety cannot be denied, especially in full-scale production, and particularly if a crew member is going to be working side by side with a mower, like a autonomous mower, but you can't sell to a property manager. A property manager won't, accept autonomous mowing unless it's very safe. And we've talked a little bit about guide wires and GPS. We have a couple of questions around that, but the viability of guide wires in the future, and what about GPS sensing and artificial intelligence? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think guide wires will be antiquated in the next 3 years. Even for the companies that are currently using them, I think they will die a pretty quick death. The main reason is there's this thing that everybody carries around in their pockets, and these things have a lot of sensors in them. They are also very expensive and subsidized by the cellular companies for our monthly plans, but they've created a new paradigm with regards to components, right? And these auto mowers are not running on really high levels of compute, but that is a cost function that is driven by the hardware business, right? So if you're making a hardware product, you're not doing a typical like Keystone pricing model, right? Because a company like Toro or Husqvarna or someone, they are making products at a certain manufacturing cost, and then there's the cost that they sell to their like distributors, and then the dealerships, and then to the landscapers who pay the ultimate bill, right? And Husqvarna is doing an interesting thing where they're going direct to customers, so they're getting a little bit of that back, but they're still looking at, if they sell an auto mower for $3,000, they need to make it for maybe $500 or $500 or $750 on the high end, right? And they have to have that direct to customer to maintain that margin, because a one-off product, even that requires a lot of engineering to go into it. So I expect that an extra $20 or $50 going into those auto mowers to be able to have a better level of compute or a better sensor suite to have a better understanding of the area around it, I think is going to happen. And I think they're already working on this a little bit with regards to setting up base stations for RTK. So this is the progress that I see already happening. What's more likely to happen is that these guide wires will fall away, but the range will not change. So if an auto mower can do 1 acre now, it will likely not do 10 acres in 2 years when they get rid of the guide wire. What will end up happening is they'll end up being able to do better positioning and have a better understanding of the world around it, but they will not be able to improve the battery life, right? And when I'm saying a couple of years, maybe I'm being optimistic, maybe this is 5 years or even 10 years for these guide wires because of the economics playing in, and these are not incredibly innovative companies in general. So it's likely that they are not going to just, throw out the baby with the bathwater and start with something fresh. But one thing that I can say for sure is that the battery is the number one problem here, right? Like you're just, it's the number one cost in any electrical system. So you're not going to be able to just triple the battery or all of a sudden change the laws of physics to get more, square footage coverage off of the same battery. It just comes down to an efficiency issue. So I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Well, GPS is the future.
Yeah, GPS is, I'd say at this point, table stakes, right? So okay. GPS is, you have to understand GPS is trigonometry at a very high order, right? Satellites are flying around space with certain positioning known, and then they're beaming down information to Earth, and then we're able to triangulate the position of those satellites, thereby triangulating the position of the device, right? Whether that's a cell phone or a robot or whatever. But there's a lot of error there, right? Especially if you go underneath a tree or if you have some building on the side and you're having half the sky occluded, that takes away half of your trigonometric function. So there's another crutch technology that's being implemented now and rolled out across the country called RTK, which stands for real-time kinematics. And what that's doing is if you're an old dog in GPS, like I would say I am, you remember the days before the government released the codes and you would have a rover station and a base station, and you would have to go out and you'd have to set up your base station and then run around with the rover gathering information. You have to come back and then bring the information between the two of them together and then compute so that you'd be able to get reasonable GPS data. And we at Landier use that for like GPS-based as-builts. But the same technology applies here. The only difference is the government released the codes and then we got much more refined accuracy. And then it's like, okay, now we have 1 to 3 meter accuracy in most cases. But then if you have another base station, you go back to the same way you did it before. You have a base station, a rover station, but instead of having to bring them back, now there are cell phones that you can just throw this data back and forth between the two. You can get a far more, like localized accuracy. So maybe you're looking at a sub-centimeter level of accuracy as opposed to a 3 to 5 meter accuracy. And that's very helpful. But I'll point out that it doesn't change the half the sky being occluded problem by buildings, right? So it has a finite level of value to be captured long term, and you see other things like cellular trigonometry or 5G, which is just more cell phone towers all over the place with shorter range but higher bandwidth. And those somebody will inevitably create some kind of localization system based off of 5G as well. They're already in existence for cell phones. They're certainly in existence for satellites, which is what GPS is. But if you make the machine, you also have things like wheel odometry that you can capture data from, and you could theoretically place tags instead of doing an entire guide wire, whereas right now you have guide wires that are the boundary lines, then you have some kind of like come back home line that runs through the middle of the space. You could theoretically do that guide wire to home with a couple, like RFID tags or some other passive tag that's underneath the ground that the robot or the little auto mower could sense to gather some kind of like, proper heading overall.
But the mower even with the potential blockages, I guess, the mower remembers if it's been on a property repeatedly. How much does the mower remember from time to time or month to month?
Yeah, so it depends on the robot. An auto mower is effectively a Roomba that has blades on the bottom, so it's not going to remember a whole lot. But if you have a Roomba, you know that there are the $300 Roombas, and then there's the $1,000 Roombas, and the $1,000 Roombas, can remember a lot more. And that's another cost function of the memory and the processor that's put into the system, right? So for us at Scythe, we're on the very, very highest high end there possible. And then for a company like Husqvarna or somebody like Works, even where they're trying to sell these things for $1,000, it is the lowest, dumbest little robot you could possibly put together with $20 and a injection mold system. So it's a wide range there, right? Like you just have to look at the piece of equipment, and then if you're really getting into the details, I don't see anybody actually doing this and having it be done well and then being able to scale this as a proper method. But you would need to look at the property and say, well, this is a really complex property. It needs a higher level auto mower. This is a really basic, stupid property that's not a lot of acreage. It can take a really cheap one. But if somebody is building a business around this, like what Robin did, for example, they should absolutely be looking at how can they blend those two and create some kind of a tiered process for their customers to be able to say, okay, this gets the high end one, this gets the low end one, and price accordingly.
To solve battery life issues, what are your thoughts on a combination of gas powered and battery life?
I'm probably a bit of a crusader in this because of my opinions with regards to environmental sustainability. I think that internal combustion engines are bad generally. I don't think that they're going to be considerably improved upon. The most efficient ICE system was made by Toyota, and it runs at about 23% efficiency. That is blown away by electrical systems that are, if you were to compare them apples to apples, you're probably looking at somewhere sub or like 23% to somewhere above 95%, right? There's just no comparison there. And those byproducts for the ICE systems are just bad overall. And then when you get into the manufacturing side of it, battery systems are going to have fewer moving parts, right? People are starting to now see that Teslas are going to survive over a million miles, whereas like an internal combustion engine system will run maybe 400,000 miles with constant maintenance, because there are just a lot of moving parts, right? So if you can eliminate the moving parts, that's better for a more durable, robust system. And I think that's what electric can provide us. And I think that it's interesting to see the battery chemistry shaping up across the board. But what's really fascinating is that there are companies starting to create these battery packs and trying to figure out how can they scale these systems and how can it go into the market and be economically viable. There are savings in not paying for gas and just getting electricity off the grid to charge the units. I think that any effort really being put into internal combustion engine systems is just, making a better bite for the horse instead of focusing on the car. And I think it's just one of these interesting things where in time we will see that jump be definitive.
And noise emission, noise pollution and emissions issues, they're, two big black marks on the landscape industry, and with noise particular, there has been a switch to the battery operated handheld equipment. But with the autonomous mowing in play, do you think contractors will be quicker to adopt or integrate autonomous mowers in their business if it will help improve their carbon footprint?
Yeah, I think that's a nice to have, not a need to have. Some states, for example, like California, it'll be a need to have, right? Other states, like I was born in Tennessee and spent a lot of time in North Carolina. Those states are less likely to impact, create some legislature that is forcing the hand. But it's an interesting dynamic, because what you really see is the more people adopt these tools, the more the industry takes it seriously, the more the vendors that actually supply electrical motors or electrical battery or electrical system components, the more they start being forced to really have their stuff together. So the big boys, the incumbent companies, everybody deals with Hydrogear, right? And Hydrogear has an electric line, but it is, in my humble opinion, it is absolute garbage. It is just not worth the attention or effort. Hydrogear, to their credit, they made something that's electric and it came out, but I think that there's a lot of paradigms that are going to shift, and there are a lot of value adds that are going to happen from those paradigm shifts. The noise and the emission reduction overall are great ones, but they are an added benefit. I don't see too many people saying, I'm changing my whole business around because it's quieter or because it doesn't pollute as much. I think it's going to be the economics shifting that creates this adjustment in the paradigm.
Well, part of that paradigm shift is the younger workforce and younger workers. All the research shows that that the environment is very important to them, and a lot of people don't want to go into the landscape industry because mowing is too hard, it's too labor intensive, it's too menial. But if the opportunity exists to work with robotics and to understand, from a data perspective, how mowing and related services can be more efficient. This is all going to culminate together, the workforce issues and the efficiency issues.
Yeah, absolutely. For what it's worth, my take there is, I remember talking to someone at the NALP, they did a study trying to figure out how do they get high school and college kids to come join the industry. And I asked her, said, what's the number one thing? And she said, well, we're really interested in what you're doing at site, because actually the top two things are, number one was, I might be getting these mixed up, but I believe number one was environmental stewardship, right? Where millennials, or I don't know what the next gen, is it Gen Z?
Gen Z.
Yeah, okay. So this generation is like, I want to make sure that I'm taking care of the environment, and I will build a career around exactly that. And in my opinion, that is 100% landscaping, right? Like, there are other things that you could be doing. You could go and join the Ocean Project, or you could just like become a homeless person that just does nothing but run around and pick up trash. But it turns out landscapers pick up a lot of trash. I'd say if there's any industry that actually picks up all the trash, I would say it's landscaping, right? So I think that's a really big one that companies can focus on. And then the other is the usage and adoption of technology, right? And so being able to say, today they say, well, I ride a mower and use a weed whacker a lot, and have headphones on while I'm using an incredibly loud blower. That might be the angle that everybody mentions what their job is today if they're a crew member. But I think in the future, it's going to be a very different angle. I think people will be saying, I deploy robots and I make sure that the environment is, in a better spot than it was before I showed up. And I do that every week on every single property that I have a contract with. And so I think that the framing will change dramatically. And I think that the technology will be one of these things that really expedites that considerably, because what robots will be able to do is they'll be able to take away the menial tasks. And over time, this will increase, right? It won't just be mowing. It turns out that mowing is just like a good use case because you can capture a large chunk of the work that needs to be done with it's relatively to like Ford, for example, it's really high technology. But with regards to, like where science is, the technology is kind of like pushing that boundary of between science and technology. So it's certainly getting there. But in the future, let's say 10 years from now, I think that it'll be robots that do mowing, that do blowing, that do edging, that do trash pickup. And maybe this isn't 10, maybe this is 20 or 25. I can't say for sure, but I think robots will increasingly take over these tasks to then allow for landscapers to actually be focused on beautification and overall sustainability, as opposed to just make sure my grass doesn't turn into a forest, which is kind of what's going on right now.
Will autonomous mowers be affordable to a typical landscape contracting company, particularly with safety and sensors and the memory, everything that goes into play to make these mowers do what they should do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if it's not affordable, it won't work, and if it won't work, then nobody will do it, and I'm sure somebody will figure it out. I think I can't speak too much to what's going on at Scythe again, but I think what's going to happen is there will likely be a shift in the business model, right? The incumbents today have this paradigm of, make a mower from the manufacturing side, sell it to the distributor side, dealership gets it from the distributor, and every single point of this chain, there's an increase in price, right? But what I found fascinating was that the actual dealer, the company that sells it to the landscaper, that has the relationship with the landscaper day to day, they don't make any money on the actual sale of the equipment, right? And in other companies that I've had, you have what's called retail keystone, right? And so retail keystone pricing is 100% markup. So if Walmart buys something for 25 cents, they try to sell it for 50 cents, and that's their whole business. And maybe Walmart is like shrinking that, but this is the idea of keystone pricing. That is not the case with dealerships today. Dealerships are in the business of making money off parts and service, right? So when you realize that, you have to wonder, how many of those dealerships are going to stock up on roboticists to fix robots? I don't think it's going to happen. I think maybe in 10 or 20 years, this is a possibility, but in the nascent state of the technology, because the demand will be there, absolutely. I think there's going to be a new paradigm, and Amazon has effectively done this, right? Like the Sears catalog is no longer a concern, and the Ford dealerships are no longer the big fish. Now Tesla sells direct to customers, and Amazon sells everything that you can possibly imagine on their website, and it comes to you from a brown truck, whether that's UPS or an Amazon truck, it doesn't matter, right? It's like the logistics pipe is being streamlined. I think that's a major shift that will basically need to happen in order for these things to be financially viable for landscapers. But I don't see that as being the major blocker. I think what's kind of interesting is that landscaping has this opportunity to create massive upsell potential, especially in commercial. I think it's less so in residential, but we, as one of many companies, have an office, and we have a commercial landscaping company that comes out and maintains it for us, and it's a cost that's baked into our triple net cost. And although I can tell you what our overall rent is, I have no clue about what the triple net cost is. But I can tell you, if someone came to me and said, hey, that tree is going to fall over on your building unless you take care of it because it has root fungus or there's some other problem with it, or if somebody says all of your grass is going to die unless you do an irrigation installation, it will have my attention, and it will absolutely be something where I say to the property manager, hey, go and take care of these things. And those upsell opportunities are what I think the future of landscaping is, as opposed to the day-to-day right now, which is just grind out the must be done kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, will service model pricing change then as well?
Yeah, I think there's a high possibility, or probably I would even say it's a probability, that these two will be baked into one another, right? Where if you look at it from the robotics perspective, if you place a robot with a customer and then something goes wrong, like the customer is going to be able to do nothing about it, and their dealership is going to be able to do nothing about it. There's just problems all the way. And even if you look at a company like Wright working with Greensey and doing it very publicly, if something goes wrong there, you're not contacting Wright. You're probably contacting Greensey unless there's a mechanical failure, and then you're talking to your Wright dealership, right? Or not even a Wright dealership, but rather the dealership that handles the Wright mowers in that area. it's a logistical pain point that I think will only be solved by integration between the robotics company and the customer, right? Because that problem completely disappears in that framework. And if that is the framework that gets built, you're looking at the pricing being in line. So it's no longer a matter of I'm going to purchase some robots and then it's my problem now kind of thing, but rather I am placing these robots. The robotics company is a partner of mine. We, basically share in revenue, and it is a profitable venture on both sides of the party, right?
From an insurance perspective, what are your thoughts on that from a landscape, getting insurance to cover robotic equipment?
Yeah, I probably shouldn't say this publicly, but the truth is, Scythe has the perspective that we are focused on safety. This is actually a number one concern for us. We look at it and say, if anything ever happens that shouldn't be happening with regards to those blades of death spinning at the bottom of a mower that we are operating autonomously, like that is the last time we cut anything, right? So it is hyper sensitive for us. We have worked with our insurance companies to build a policy that will cover everyone. But and we see it as if something is run over autonomously, then this is something that we need to have our insurer cover, and this is a liability that we see in the long term. What's fascinating to me is that the insurance companies don't see this. So I've kind of become accustomed to, basically explaining it like, look, this is skyscraper insurance in a pre-9/11 world, right? Like someone is going to take a plane and fly it into a gigantic skyscraper, and then all of a sudden, insurance companies around the world will be pricing for man-made mega catastrophes. I think that the insurance companies today don't understand this. And I have a strong suspicion that someone, very likely not Scythe, someone will get hurt. And it will be a blow to adoption. But I don't think that the blow to adoption will be as big as the blow to the insurance bill. I think the insurance bill will adjust accordingly when that event occurs. But I just don't know when or who that will be. I can only speak to, us being the ones. Well, I can say that we are heavily focused on it not being us.
Correct. Well, I think we're just about out of time today, Isaac. We really appreciate you joining us here, and we hope to have you back maybe in the next short time. And you'll have some more information to share about the progress of Scythe and autonomous mowing. So thank you very much for your time. And we wanted to thank all the attendees for joining us here today, and remind folks that tomorrow we'll send an email with a recorded copy of this presentation, so you can share it with other folks in your company. So from the Harvest Group, we thank you for joining us here today, and we'll see everybody next time.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Cindy.